Hi folks, it is Thibaut Van Dam here with another YouTube video. And for those of you who are not familiar with my channel, I am a DIY singer-songwriter and also guitar tutor based in Southeast London. And today I'm very excited to be continuing my series about practical guitar and also music theory. Specifically, we're going to be looking at what is called the Harmonized Major 7th scale. And this is an extension of the video I made last week where we were harmonizing the major scale. And the purpose of that video was to associate major and minor chords with each given scale degree in a major scale. So for example, we know that we have a major scale. And the basis of this concept is that if we are to play notes that already are within that scale, we can construct triads and chords. And by stacking enough notes, we come up with those triads. So we find that there's actually a formula associated with the major and minor chords in every major scale, or what we can say now is the major key signature. And so the value, of course, of that idea is that we now know which chords specifically are going to sound good together. But we can take this one step further, and in a very literal sense, by stacking an additional diatonic third, which therefore tells us which major seventh, minor seventh, and also which dominant chord goes with which of those respective scale degrees. And at this point, you should know about alternate chords, and I will, of course, go through a list of prerequisites, things that you need to know. But instead of playing the major scale and the major C major key signature like we just did, we can actually play it like this now. It's subtle, it's nuanced, it's jazzy, and it is a different way to think about writing songs right off the bat. So on the surface, it just makes things sound a little bit more interesting, I would say. But there are actually theoretical significant aspects of learning this. Specifically, that when we get to one of these chords in particular, we find that it is actually a dominant chord. And that chord in particular, some people might say sounds bluesy. That relationship between the root and its minor seventh as seen within a major chord. And this specific aspect is what we call the dominant chord. And I have gone over this in my video about alternate chords, but understanding this is absolutely essential for understanding the idea of functional harmony, because we start to think about the use case of the dominant chord and how it relates to the tonic. And we find that this relationship guides us in lots of ideas, including the one I mentioned last week of secondary dominance. So this is a really fun, exciting idea. And as we'll learn by the end of today's video, there's actually a formula associated with which major and minor chords go together and in which order. And that can be carried through with major seventh, minor seventh, and in fact the dominant chord. So you will then at that point know how to play every chord in every major scale, which is super exciting. So if this sounds interesting to you, please stay tuned. Please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It is the best way to stay in the loop, of course, and it does motivate me to keep coming back, keep making videos. I don't make money from this, and I did see that I got some new subscribers, so thank you for subscribing, and as always, thank you for writing comments. I really appreciate it. I got a lot of positive comments on the last video, and so let's just go ahead and get into it. So I mentioned that there's some prerequisites, some things that you need to know in order to understand today's video. And I did mention, it was a little joke that I made in the last video about it being the most important music theory idea you'll ever learn. Today could be thought of as the second most important music theory idea today. Second most important music theory idea you'll ever learn. But you won't be able to understand this if you don't understand your rudimentary theory, which is in all actuality far more important than secondary dominance, borrowed chords, whatever. If you don't understand the chromatic scale, for instance, you're gonna struggle with today's video. So what is the chromatic scale? This is the first thing that you probably should know when it comes to music theory. It's all the notes that you can possibly play. There are 12 notes. Some of them are called sharp. Those same notes that are called sharp could also be called flat. It's a relative term, a relative concept. It's important to know what those notes are and the fact that they don't change. And so yeah, these are what those notes are. I put them up on the screen, bearing in mind the notes that are indicated as being sharp could also be called the ladder notes flat. You need to know about equal temperament. Equal temperament is actually really the bread and butter of all music theory in my mind. I think one of the greatest misconceptions when it comes to music is that we use letters to describe the notes. For instance, the letter A, the letter F. And so we have a tendency to associate the letters of notes with words or significances and meaning associated with things, as though the letter F is more valuable or useful than the letter A, or that A being a vowel is somehow more impactful. But in all reality, notes in the chromatic scale are more like specific inch marks on a ruler. So all to say that inch marks like 0, 1, 2, that each note is more like an inch on a ruler, especially this ruler because there are 12 inch marks. And in this sense, music is very fair because you can make a major chord, a minor chord, major scale, minor scale with any note. There's nothing special about F or E that means that you cannot play a certain chord or scale. This is a huge thing to understand, especially because it relates to all the ladder concepts that are built off of this thing. So moving forward, after we know what equal temperament is in the chromatic scale, you need to know what intervals are. And in the same example with the ruler, intervals could be thought of as characterizations of the space between any two given notes. So for example, here we have a ruler, the space between 0 and 2, we could call the equivalent of a major second, a space of 2 frets or 2 notes. Now 0 and 2 is 2 inches, so is, say, 3 and 5. 3 and 5 is also 2 inches. And so that's 2 inches. This could also be the same interval as 0 to 2. 0 to 2 is the same, therefore, as 3 to 5. Now, it's important to know that if you're measuring from the number 3, that 2 inches from 3 is in fact 5. And in that same sense, the symbols of those space marks, like 3, 5, 7, whatever, that you need to know what those are. That is the equivalent of the notes themselves, like F sharp or A. But as far as the spaces go, you need to know what those are, and there are 12 simple intervals, and I put an image up of what those are. You need to know what the major scale is, of course, because we are harmonizing the major scale today. So the major scale is a formula founded on both whole steps and half steps, so that is two notes or 1 note respectively. And it starts with a root. A root can be any note in the chromatic scale, and this is because of equal temperament. Like I said, you can have an E major scale and F major scale, F sharp major scale, G major scale, as you want. It's all based on the formula more so than it is the specific note that you're starting on. This is true also of major and minor triads, which you should also be familiar with. They are formulas founded on a root, so any note can become a major or minor chord. But for the purposes of today's video, you also need to know about alternate chords. I've made a video about those. That includes, and just the most simple alternate chords, including things like major 7th chords, minor 7th chords, and dominant chords. You need to know what those formulas are. They're very similar to the major and minor triads. But they include what is called the 7th scale degree. So major 7th and minor 7th scale degrees, we get, or rather intervals, we get those intervals from our intervallic chart, which I'll bring up again. And then you need to know about, of course, scale degrees themselves and the Roman numeral system, which is a way of characterizing scale degrees with elements of majorness and minorness associated with it. We will be going through some of these ideas again today, but it will definitely help if you know what they are. If you saw the last video, of course, it would probably help you a ton because we're going through all the same ideas that we did in the last video. Again, today, we're just modifying it slightly. So with all that out of the way, now that I'm 8.5 minutes, holy shit, into the video, get a notebook, get a pen, let's do this. So the first thing we start with, the starting point of this process is, of course, the major scale, because how else do we harmonize the major scale if we don't start there? So we start with the major scale, and then, like I said, the major scale is a formula. That formula starts with a root followed by a relative whole step, another relative whole step, then a half step, 3 whole steps, and then a final half step takes us back to the note that we started on, or that root. This is what that formula looks like, and this is what we've got so far. Okay, now like I said, this formula can be used with any note in the chromatic scale. So whatever we're about to do, just bear in mind that the formula is not changing, that the formula is the same. And for the purposes of today's video, and in the spirit of writing less and just getting through this in one go, let's go ahead and solve for C major. So using this formula and our knowledge of the chromatic scale, we know that the C major scale includes the following notes: C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and then finally C again if you do that final half step that I wrote. So this is our C major scale, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Now let's just take a minute and remember what it is that we're actually trying to do. We are trying to harmonize notes within this scale. Another way of saying that, and specifically how to outline the method of doing that, is stacking diatonic thirds. So diatonic is a technical term referring to the notes within a given scale. So the given scale right now is C major, but like I said just a moment ago, if we were solving for D, it would be the notes in D. It wouldn't really make a difference because this formula, again, is always the same. So just because we solve for C doesn't mean we couldn't do the same thing with D or F or whatever. Now, thirds. What are thirds? Thirds in this case are referring to relative thirds. So we're solving for each of the notes in this scale, but we'll start with C. So we're going to solve for a C chord, then we're going to solve for a D chord, and then an E chord, an F chord, and so on. Thirds would mean, in this case, every other note. That's the easiest way I can think to explain it, but they're relative thirds. So E is a third away from C, so we'll circle the note E, and then we'll solve for the next third. The third now away from E is G. Then we'll solve, in this case, this is the thing that we're doing different today, because we did this in the last video. We are going to solve for one more diatonic third. In this case, that note is the note B. And when we put these notes together, we find that it equates to a chord. In this case, because of the fact that there are 4 components, we end up with a chord extension or an alternate chord, what have you. So we know that C, E, and G is a C major chord, and that consists of the 3rd fret on the A string, which is the note C, the 2nd fret on the D string, which is the note E, and then the open G string. And if we just played these 3 notes, these 3, then we would be playing the C major, but we've now chosen to add in a B. So the easiest way to add that B into this chord in particular is to leave the open B string open. Now, when we traditionally play a C, we actually fret that note, we fret that string on the 1st fret, and in so doing, we end up playing the octave. This is actually the note C. And if you think about it, that makes sense because B goes to C right after. There's no B sharp, just like there's no C flat. There's just B, C, and then C sharp. So all we're doing is removing this note, and we end up playing C, E, G, and B. What we find then is we're going to calculate the distance from B to the prior C, a space of 11 frets. This is because if we did 12 frets, we would be playing the octave. Again, remember the intervallic series. So here, this would be our octave, so the amount of space just before the octave is the major 7th. So we find that what we're playing is something that I'd like to call musically congruent. It is a major chord, right, because of the root, the major 3rd, and the perfect 5th. But it is also congruent because it has a major 7th interval added in. So we have a major thing with another major thing, and the result is it sounds pleasing to hear. There's nothing inconsistent about this. I'm just going to point that out because I'm going to point it out again, and there will be one instance where this is not the case. And if you saw my video about alternate chords, you'll know which one it is. So we've solved for that first chord, C plus E plus G plus B equals, and I'm going to write C major plus the major 7th interval. So that's what I've written. Now, I'm going to go ahead and start characterizing each and every single one of those notes as they appeared in that chord. And just like in the last video, what we'll find is that we can actually establish a template through which to solve all these chords. So the C was our root. E, just above that, we found was our 3rd scale degree. It was our 3rd interval, we could say. So in this case, it was a major 3rd, but we'll find that this column of thirds can be major or minor thirds. And then the G was the perfect 5th, and we'll find that that is in fact always the column of 5ths. And then finally, B is our column of 7ths. In this case, a major 7th. So this is what I've written. So this is the process that we go through. Now let's go ahead and solve for another chord. So we solved for C, now let's solve for the D chord. So we'll start by, and I recommend grabbing a different colored pen. I'm going to use blue now. I'm going to circle D, and we're going to do the exact same thing we just did. We're going to take D, and we're going to stack a diatonic third from that, which is F, right? Because we're skipping away one of the notes. So we got D, F. We skip another note from F, so the diatonic third from F in this case is A. and then a third diatonic third. This is that harmonized major seventh thing that we're doing. And when I say seventh, I'm of course referring to the seventh interval, that it's major and minor seventh. So even though it says major, even though I've said in this video today that we're doing the harmonized major seventh scale, that doesn't mean all the chords are major seventh. It just means that it's major and that we're stacking the seventh interval on top, even though it can sound kind of confusing. So then the third diatonic third, according to D, is actually C. D, F, A, and C. I've used blue so that you can discern between them. So our root, of course, is D because we are solving for the D chord of some kind. And what we find is that we are stacking F plus A plus C. And what chord does this equal out to? Well, like we found in the last video, the first three notes, D, A, and F, that is the open D string, the second fret on the G string, which is A, and then the first fret on the E string, that is this note, and not including that pinky note, but then these three notes, that is a D minor chord. And now what we realize is that we've added that extra element in, that is the C. So what we need to now do is we need to figure out the easiest way to play the note C with these other two notes. Now, if we look at that octave, again, it's always the octave that we'll be adjusting here. The third fret on the B string, that note, or in this case before, it was the note my pinky was playing, so I said to ignore it, but now that is the note D. You'll hear that too, it's the octave. Interchangeable, almost. We find that C as a note is actually very close. If they were inches again on a ruler, C would be like the 10th inch mark, and that D would be the 12th, right? The octave. So what we need to do is ask ourselves this question: how many spaces or frets are between C and D? We find it's a whole step away because there is a chromatic note in between the two. A note that does not fit into this scale, which is C sharp or D flat. So then what we do is we accommodate for that by then playing the C on the first fret of the B string. And we would also know that this was C because of the chord we just played, C major, right? That was B, that's C. We're just keeping that C right there. So now we're playing the D minor 7. And the way we know that this is D minor 7, of course, is by asking that question: how many spaces are between C and the prior D? And that is a space of 10 frets. Again, the intervallic chart that I have, the intervals, the chart of intervals is 10 frets, is a minor 7th away. And the net result is that we are playing a D minor chord with a minor 7th. And just to emphasize this, this is also a musically major, minorly speaking, congruent chord. It is a minor thing with yet another minor thing within it, right? We've added a minor interval to a chord that was already inherently minor. This is important because these chords sound more or less really enjoyable to just listen to. Now let's go through those first two chords again just to hear what they sound like. We have the first two chords in the C major 7 key signature, C major 7, then D minor 7. And they sound pleasing onto themselves and actually together, one after the other. Okay. So at this point, I would say to continue to go through this series, circling diatonic thirds, basically saying if you're going to solve for the next chord, E, for instance, in this case it would be E, stack the diatonic thirds. We have E, stack the G, stack the B, and then one more diatonic third from the B is D. So E, G, B, and D. And you would write them down here, E, G, B, and D. Oh, sorry, E, G, B, and D. And then you would figure out what chord that is. Now, I want to take a second just to explain something, which is that this process can be sort of cheated a little bit. Now, I would say if you hadn't done this process in the last video, that you should go through this process now. And I would just say pause and just do it. But if you do want to cheat, I'll show you how and why we can cheat. Now, I said before that we were setting up a template, right? And the template was, in fact, to establish these columns. This is the column of roots. This is the column of thirds. In this case, E was the major third of C, just like F was the minor third of D. So we find that all these notes are the third intervals as they relate to the roots, major or minor third. Same with these. G is the perfect fifth interval of C, just like A is the perfect fifth interval of D. So we find that this is our column of fifths. And finally, what we've just added in the new thing today is the column of sevenths. That B is the major seventh of C, just like, oh, come on, please focus. Okay. Just like C is the major seventh, hopefully, yeah. C is the minor seventh, my bad. C is the minor seventh of D. So we find that this is actually a column of sevenths. Okay, so we've learned that there's something formulaic, pattern-based happening here. Now the next thing we can take note of, formulaically speaking, is that they are all alphabetized according to the chromatic scale. Notice how the series of roots is going to go C, D, E, F, G, because we were about to solve for E. Notice how the following subsequent component of the chord is also alphabetized. This column of thirds is E, F, it's going to be G, A, B, C, and so on. Just like this, G, A, B, C, and so on, and then B, C, D, E, and it's going to go C, and if you want C to C, E to E, G to G, and B to B again. And so we can basically cheat by alphabetizing each of these columns. Yeah. Now, I've actually already gone through this process, and so because of that, I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead, but I just kind of want to show you what that looks like, at least for one of them, just because if you wouldn't know, then, I mean, if you couldn't see, then how would you know? C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. That's like one example, this one column, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. So I've skipped ahead, and this is what we end up with. Now, in the most intuitive instance, we've now solved for each of the chords in the C major key signature when we harmonize it to that additional diatonic third. We find the first chord, like we just solved for, is a C major 7, that the second chord is a D minor 7, the third chord is E minor 7, the fourth chord is F major 7, then the fifth chord is G dominant. This is an important one to take note of, and I'll come back to that in a sec. And then the sixth chord is A minor 7, and then the seventh chord is B half diminished, or B minor 7 flat 5. So we'll talk about that too, but let's just start with the dominant chord. So we find that each of these is, musically speaking, in that major minor sense, congruent. So if we go back through this, you'll see that this seventh scale degree was a major seventh in a major chord, musically congruent, major 7. The next chord is a minor chord with a minor seventh. The next chord is a minor chord with a minor seventh, again, musically congruent. But when we get to the G chord, we find that it's actually dominant. And this is because it is a fundamentally major chord because of the major third that we have here, G to B. B is the major third of G. That's what makes it a major chord. But that what we find is that actually the note F is a minor seventh away from G. And we get here by basically doing the process, right? We circle G, we skip the diatonic third, we go to B. We skip a diatonic third, we go to D, and then one more diatonic third goes to F. And what we find is that F is actually a whole step away from the following G, or it is 10, we could say 10 notes away from the prior G. And so the result is that this is a space, just like before, of a minor seventh. And where we have a minor element within a major chord, we find that there is musical tension, really very musical sounding tension. So the G7. Now I'd shown a way to play G7 before, or to play the G major chord. G major can be played like this as the open chord. And to play it as the 7, again, what we're doing is taking the octave. The third fret on the E string is another G, that note there, and we're going to flatten it by a whole step to the first fret of the E string, which is the note F, E, F, F sharp, G. This is a very dominant forward sounding chord, or voicing of the chord, because the dominant, the minor seventh element is on top. So it's the last thing we hear. So we hear mostly major, interrupted by a minor thing, an inconsistent thing at the end. Another way to play the same chord in the way that I've been playing it is actually using the cage system. So we use the E major chord, E, and using this chord, we bar it to play F, F sharp, and G. But now we play essentially the shape and the voicing of the E7 shape. So we have our major chord with the minor seventh right there. And this is a dominant shape that can be moved around. G dominant, F sharp dominant, F dominant, E dominant. All of those chords that are called dominant could also be called 7. So we find that the 5th chord here, G, is a 7, G7 or G dominant. Okay, let's talk about the half diminished chord, the B half diminished. So we talked about in the last video how we have this new chord, a new triad, B diminished. What makes this half diminished is the fact that the 7th scale degree is actually the minor 7th. And if you remember what I had said in the last video, that this chord is an inherently minor chord because of the root and its minor 3rd. So weirdly, even though it sounds kind of jazzy and kind of really out there, this is actually, musically speaking, major minor sense-wise, it is in fact congruent. It is a minor chord with a minor 7th in it. And if not for the flattened 5th, we would actually just have a minor 7th chord. But we flatten the 5, and so there is an element of tension in that. There are 2 ways to call this chord. It is either called the half diminished chord because it is not a full diminished chord because of the octave, or you could also call it a minor 7 chord, like I just pointed out, but with the flattened 5th. So it is a minor 7th chord because it is a root, a minor 3rd, and a minor 7th, but now we're specifying that the 5th, the perfect 5th, has been flattened. Okay, so that does it for C major, but let's abstract this to the formula that I've been alluding to, the thing that's really gonna just open doorways for us. So just like in the last video, we found that each of these chords, because the process of stacking diatonic thirds is actually a constant, just like all the other rudimentary theory, like the idea of the chromatic scale and how each note has equal temperament, just like that, we find that the stacking of diatonic thirds relates back to the idea of a scale, and it's the scale you're talking about. So like I said before, we could have been solving for D, and we would get the same chord qualities in this order. That the first chord would be a major chord, the second chord would be a minor chord, third would be minor. And so we found a way to abstract this to a formula down here, where we use major 1, minor 2, minor 3, major 4, major 5, minor 6, and then diminished 7 chord. And what we can do now is basically abstract all of the extensions, major 7th, minor 7th, to the formula as well. We can basically adopt them to this formula so that we have a 1 major 7 chord, a minor 7th 2 chord, a minor 7 3 chord, a major 7 4 chord, a dominant 5 chord, a minor 7 6 chord, which I know sounds funny, but it is what it is in the sense that this is the 6th scale degree. And then we have the half diminished 7 chord, and we have a unique symbol for that, which is just like the diminished, the circle in the top right corner, but with a line going through it. That tells us it is half diminished, and I think it's fairly intuitive. You got diminished as the circle, half of that half diminished. And this is an incredibly powerful formula. What it means is that now you can play every key signature and also those key signature extensions, at least one related to a major key signature. And what we'll find with modes is that this actually extends even beyond what we just did. It's really exciting. So let's just take, for instance, the scale of E major. Root, whole, whole, half, whole. We can now associate majorness and minorness with each of those scale degrees, just like we solved for. Major 1, minor 2, minor 3, major 4, major 5. And we can also do it with the extensions. Major 7 1, minor 7 2, minor 7 3, major 7 4, dominant 5, major 7 4, minor 7 3, minor 7 2, major 7 1. And so this is the power of what we just did. It's a really exciting thing, taking special note, of course, of the dominant 5 chord. Dominant 5 chord is going to be something we refer to later, especially when we look at the idea of secondary dominance. I'm sure you can imagine why. Secondary dominance, dominant 5 chord, it's going to start coming together. And I'm just so excited to get to the next couple videos. The next video I'm going to be looking at is going to be about the relative major-minor relationship. It's very exciting. And I've already made that video and I feel really proud of it because I think it came out perfect. And then eventually we will get to functional harmony. And man, I'm excited for that. So I hope you found this video informative and helpful. I hope you understand the idea of the harmonized major 7th scale and key signature a little bit better. And if you did, please consider liking the video. Please consider subscribing to the channel. It is the best way to stay in the loop. And of course, it does motivate me to keep making content like this. Thank you to everyone that does subscribe. It really does mean a lot. And if you have any questions, please feel free to write a thing in the comments below or reach out for a free first lesson. And I'll be sure to get back to you either way. And yeah, I'll see you at the next one. I'm really excited about it. Ciao for now.